Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and we're in day 2 of the 2012 Global Education Conference. We had a terrific day yesterday. It feels like today should just be starting, but for many, their hours already passed. We're really grateful to have Andy Revkin here. Andy, thanks so much.
Good to be with you. Can't wait. This is just a really exciting opportunity to get global. I write all the time about the prospects of using web connectivity, whether it's through Twitter or co-learning of this kind, to foster progress on a finite planet. You know, I use these tools as they relate to fitting human aspirations on a finite planet, which is sometimes hard considering we have infinite aspirations, it seems, and we're often focused on the near and the now. And so going global through an education, especially at early stage, I think can be a really, really good way for young people to sort of get to understand that they can have an influence around the world. If a good idea can travel at light speed, and the collaborative potential of getting two ideas together or two skill sets has never been greater than now, and it's all can be done at the speed of electrons or photons if it's fiber optics. So the talk I'm going to give today is a quick tour of what I call the Knowosphere, which is this, you'll see it sounds like a new word, but it actually builds on a very old, well, a pretty old word, a 70-year-old word. And I'm going to explain at the end what this image you're looking at describes, and also why there's a pound sign ahead of Noosphere, which I'm sure many of you recognize from Twitter. You're a special audience compared to some that I speak with. So let's get going, because it's a big world and there's lots to cover. And
Andy?
Yeah.
Let's do this little piece we do where we let people indicate where they're from in the world.
Oh yeah, sure.
So look to the left of the map. You can see a little star. Click on that star twice and then place yourself on the map. Feel free to do a shout out in the chat as well.
This is cool.
Yeah, you're the perfect voice for this conference.
I'm glad I see British Columbia popping up. I've enjoyed researching a book there a long time ago. It's an amazing place. And is that Thailand? Somewhere over there.
Wherever you're participating from, thanks for being here. Because of the way the conference works, we will have people who will come in from other sessions. Please, in the chat, do welcome them. And now, Andy, I will let you move forward. Thanks so much.
Sure. So as I was saying a second ago, the last thing the world needs is a new word. So but luckily you'll see that Knowosphere is just a new spelling of a fairly old word. It's been around for about 70 years. And the concept, though, is that we're essentially sheathing the world in our intelligence, and if we can use these networks intelligently and purposefully, we can, I think, foster progress on this planet that can keep up with our impacts. It's going to be a changed planet for sure, but let's get going, and I'll kind of explore some possibilities. The reality is we've felt pretty bummed out. Those of us like me who focused for decades on global environmental trends have been concerned, because it seems like the world hasn't really been going in effective directions, whether your issue is greenhouse gas emissions or the loss of biodiversity. If we can have the next slide. A lot of people I know have felt like this photographer whose picture I took at the end of the climate talks in Copenhagen in 2009. And you can see it's a combination of exhaustion, exasperation, and just sort of a general sense of malaise. And the trends, next slide, the trends are clearly pointed in a direction that implies there's huge things going on. This is one depiction of the curve of population growth in recent decades. And you can go to the website there, populationaction.org, plunk in your birth date like I did, and find out where you started contributing to the curve of us. And remember, in the year 1800, there were just 1 billion people. Now there are 1 billion teenagers alone on planet Earth, and that's a big deal. So just think of 1 billion teenagers, wrap your head around that, and you can understand the concerns we have for the state of the world right now. But again, I feel overall that we can kind of work things out.
So, Andy, one thing you and I didn't do when we covered everything this morning was I didn't show you how to move the slides forward. So right above the slides are two little arrows, and you can click on the one to the right, and then you have to hand on me.
I can do it myself. Okay, great. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm new to this particular technology, and so think about, we're heading toward 9 billion people, 7 billion of us right now. Think about if all the world shopped on Black Friday, what that would look like. This is a photographer. The New York Times took this picture several years ago, one of those epic days. And of course now Black Friday has moved already. The marketeers have moved it to Black Thursday. So even on Thanksgiving Day already the big sales start. So we're kind of, think about that. So it's not just how many people, it's how much stuff as well. And this leads to some pretty sobering prospects for climate and resources. And we're kind of like bacteria growing on a plate of agar. So far, there isn't a lot to distinguish our habits on this planet from that of bacteria smeared on a plate of a nutrient. And scientists in recent decades essentially have been pointing out, as you can see around the edge, that there's an edge to the Petri dish. That's been the voice of science. But we have been kind of like those teenagers I spoke about. We've been kind of in grow mode and we don't really think ahead. You can see that in so many of our attributes right now. We have extinguished a number of species. We just look at how we build in harm's way, like just happened in Hurricane Sandy. I just have a post back up on .earth right now that just went up this morning about this pattern of when we get wealthy and sometimes when we're forced to by poverty, we build in the world's most dangerous places, whether it's a fire zone or a flood zone. And as I said, scientists, here was one of the climate scientists in 2007 at the IPCC meeting, the big climate change meeting, essentially pointing to the edge of the Petri dish, the food, coasts, health. These are the issues that where climate change will have an impact on human prospects. But we don't want to hear that kind of thing. Sometimes when I show this, I show a clip from the movie Rebel Without a Cause, where James Dean, the actor, his character is being chided by his father, Jim Backus, and you can see James Dean kind of holding his hands over his ears, saying, get out of my head, get out of my face. And as society, I think, as I've written periodically on .earth, we're kind of like we've been in our teenage mode for a century or so, just kind of saying, wow, look what I can do. And now, again, the prospect is that we can start to find a more mature relationship with the planet. It's kind of like moving from a sprint to a marathon pace, pace that works for the long haul. And that's the shift toward what some people call sustainability. Now, at the same time as we've been going through this pulsing of growth in our appetites and numbers, the way we learn about the world has changed. Back in the old days, when I was a young person, I grew up every night with my family having supper, comfort food usually, and listening to some white guy, sort of uncular figure like Walter Cronkite, tell us the state of the world. He used to say, his sign-off was, for those who recall it, was, right. Yeah, so we had it so easy back then. We were told the way it is, and we could just sit back, and the whole national community, and via BBC and other similar enterprises, the world essentially learned the state of the world as a common experience. And now we're in a media market where if your issue is climate, or you can pick your issue, gun rights or animal welfare or the economy, you go to websites, and here is just some of the climate places on the out there in the infosphere, and you can still dine on that same common meal, that comfort food meal, like we used to with Walter Cronkite. But now you're at the world's biggest food court. So if you're skeptical on global warming, you can go to What's Up With That, or if you're very worried about it already and want government restrictions on greenhouse gases, go to Climate Progress or 350.org. Or you can go to .earth to learn kind of where the science is behind a lot of the rhetoric, or the NOAA sites. So it's like a buffet, and that's the downside of the internet. Essentially, while it has this great capacity to connect us, it can also amplify our divisions. if it's used in a certain way. And that's why I think there's great opportunities in learning for how to teach kids and adults how to navigate in this mess and to avoid living in a bubble. To know that your tendency is to want to live in a bubble. We all have that tendency to be liked by your peers and your tribe, quote unquote. But so how can you break out of that? And I think there are ways forward again. And by the way, one thing that's important too, all of that, just like this climate mess that we talk about, all of that is a tiny part of the global conversation about issues. So this is from a website called newsmap.jp, which is really amazing. You go there and you can see what the world or your country is thinking about at any one time in the news. And you can see way down in the middle toward the bottom, that's the same image of all this discussion about climate change. It's a tiny part of the overall discussion about what matters in the world. And that can be sobering to those who care about issues like environmental quality, but it's reality, and getting comfortable with that reality is something that's important. So another factor before I get to kind of the upside of all this is, as I said, we kind of have behavioral traits that get us thinking tribally. And you can even, as I wrote here a few years ago on .earth, you can pick a Nobel Prize winner, a Nobel Prize winning physicist to suit your views of global warming. There's one for everybody. The upper left-hand corner is Bert Richter, who is very concerned about climate change and feels that nuclear power and big innovations in energy technology are the way forward. Ivar Gaever on the right-hand side, the upper side there, he's a climate skeptic. He feels the whole issue has been oversold as a crisis. Steve Chu or Robert Laughlin. So you can kind of go out there and choose even a Nobel Prize winning physicist to fit your mindset. And the website culturalcognition.net is a useful place where scientists working on the behavioral scientists are kind of laying out why we tend to have this tribal quality, why there are liberals and libertarians among every sample of people, and what you can do to sort of foster constructive discussion, even knowing that. A quick example is that the divisions don't go away. Suppose all the world really got worried about global warming. Now here are two individuals who are really worried and actively pushing for action on global warming. George Monbiot, at the left with the white shirt, is a British environmental writer. And Bill McKibben at the right, who I'm sure many people know as a climate activist here and a writer. When the Fukushima accident happened, that's the explosion there, the hydrogen explosion after the tsunami, they drew starkly different conclusions about what that said to the world. George wrote that this proved that nuclear power was robust and it was essential in fighting global warming. Bill McKibben said this proved that nuclear power is brittle and needs to be eliminated, and we should all shrink our energy footprints and rely on local sources. So don't expect the divisions among us to go away, even if you kind of cut out the confusion about climate change itself. And just to get one more sense of our habits, I wrote after the same thing, the tsunami, about these tsunami stones that are positioned on the hills leading up from the waterfront on the east coast of Honshu Island, which was so hammered and devastated by the tsunami. And the stones, this one had this inscription: "High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point." You can't get any clearer than that. There were waves in the past that had devastated that shoreline, yet time passes and we build in harm's way. And it's a pattern that one of my readers a few years ago mused on. He said, well, maybe we're just stuck with blah, 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 bang as our kind of disaster policy. And I actually just reprised that recently in writing about Hurricane Sandy. Can we get out of that habit? And I do think there are ways forward. And my own learning curve toward thinking about the Knowosphere, or this collaborative potential, and the web started to build when I was writing about disasters. I went to Istanbul in 2009 and wrote about the inevitable earthquake that will devastate that city once again. It's been devastated a number of times in the last 1,000 years. And I went to schools where kids were doing their drills and hiding under their desks, which is great. And this is a school that had been retrofitted with some World Bank money to make it safer. But what was interesting was, when you're a journalist, you go to a place like that, and you're like a kid magnet. And kids just come running up, and usually they're saying things like American or trying out some English phrase. And here they were yelling, Facebook? And I went, what? I just couldn't believe that these kids were on Facebook. And I went, this is a poor neighborhood. They didn't have computers, but they had one community center where they did have computers, and the kids were all sitting there playing Farmville and other games that my son back home in the Hudson Valley was playing as well. And that it really was kind of an epiphany for me, because I saw right then the potential for kids to be playing together in real time, and how that can shift to kids learning together, and then building innovative partnerships together, whether they go into science or design or anything else. And you could see it right there. And I started doing reporting on how translation interfaces were also aiding this capacity for people speaking Turkish to communicate in real time with those speaking English. You're going to see just amazing advances on that front in a nanosecond by historical time frames. And that all got me very excited, as did the fact that just a few months after, well, for months after that visit to Istanbul, a number of these kids are now my Facebook friends, which, it's not like I'm communicating with them directly, but if I were their age, I could be, or might be. And it's just, to me, illustrates the potential for where we're at right now. Now, when I was a kid their age, I'm sure some of you listening right now had a pen pal somewhere in the world, and it used to be this kind of antiquated, time-consuming process where you'd send a crinkly letter to in my case, a young man in West Cameroon in Africa, and then I'd wait a couple of weeks and the letter would come back, and it would be very exciting. And now we can do this in a heartbeat with a click, or just through video communication for places with bandwidth. You can have meaningful interactions and be co-learning and then collaborating going forward. So this is Knowosphere, back to this word. Now, of course, I said, luckily, it's not a new word. It's just a new spelling. The old word is Noosphere, which comes from the Greek root that can be split into planet of the mind. And it grows out of the thinking and writing of two men, the theologian from France, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and Vladimir Vernadsky, who was a Russian earth scientist who in the 30s, he's the first person I know of who, in a very scientific way, said that humans were becoming a geological force on the planet. We were moving so many things, minerals, changing the atmosphere, changing the flow of rivers. And together they kind of came forward with this idea that essentially our intelligence was creating a sheath. We were poised to have a sheath of intelligence that was sort of a sustaining aspect of the planet going forward. And I think that we're kind of starting to see how that could work out. And this actually has deeper roots. I started digging in on this idea. And it turns out that Darwin in The Descent of Man really kind of captured it pretty well too. He said, as we advance in civilization, small tribes will unite into bigger communities. And this is through commerce and trade. Remember how trade has changed the world. Globalization has downsides, but this is part of the upside. And then he talked about, he said basically there's only an artificial barrier to prevent this man's sympathies extending to the men of all nations and races. In other words, the artificial barrier was that we weren't in touch with people around the world and didn't have a sort of a real sense of presence for them, but now we do through the same kinds of means that are connecting me to you today. And that we're breaching that artificial barrier essentially. So just to encapsulate, to sort of summarize briefly, the idea is that this Knowosphere is a network of schools, libraries, businesses, agencies, .orgs, and other institutions eager to collaborate in fostering human progress on a finite but thriving planet. Now what this implies, of course, is there has to be intentionality. Remember, as I said, the web can work in other ways. It can divide us. It can confuse us. It can be very polarizing. It can be very build barriers. It can also foster bad things. You know, the terrorists in 9/11 learned a lot of the things that they then carried out by going online. They found their flight schools and all that stuff. So it definitely can work in different ways. But I still, you can saw a recent variant of this with the YouTube video that inflamed passions around the world. But I think the upside will swamp the downside. the global outcry over the shooting of Malala in Pakistan, I think, demonstrates how this can work in the other direction. And then there's this whole thing, you know, we think of, in the realm I write on, the environment and climate, when you think of innovations or technologies, you think about a new solar panel or a better wind turbine blade or a battery. But you're looking right now at an innovation, an invention. This was the hashtag as a Twitter device, as a tool for aggregating a conversation in Twitterland, was invented. It was invented by Chris Messina, who was at the time working, I think, for Mozilla, the software company, lived in San Diego area, and he said, hey, how do you feel about using pound for groups, as in hashtag #barcamp? And that was 2007, way back in 2007. And just a couple months after that, San Diego had an outbreak of fires. And San Diego Fire became the first real live hashtag event where if you lived in that area and wanted to know what regions were evacuating or where the biggest fires were, you could find out in a second on Twitter by using that hashtag as a convening. It's like the port keys in Harry Potter or something. It's a way for us all to sort of latch on to one thing and build a conversation. And I think that's important to note, that innovation can be in ways to communicate as well. And you know, a lot of what's on Twitter looks like noise. There's a mapping tool for Twitter that shows you what's being discussed around the world anytime, and a lot of it's Bieberism and Kardashian and stuff like that. But there are ways to cut through that, and actually in pedagogy as well, as I'll mention in a minute. NASA has learned the power of Twitter with its asteroid watch. Twitter ID. There's a program at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that's tracking big bad rocks that are going to, some piece of an asteroid is going to hit this planet someday, as has happened repeatedly in the past, and it's going to create a disaster. But there's a lot of hype about these rocks as well, and so by diving into Twitter, to engaging on the web, NASA has built a reliable place to go when there's something confusing about that, another end of the world forecast. And so 1 million people now are following Asteroid Watch. At Pace University, where I teach, every one of my courses now has a hashtag. So when we meet and throughout the course of the week, the students are encouraged to express themselves about what we're learning using Pace blog as a tag for our course. So, and that spills out into the broader community. A number of our Twitter posts have been retweeted by others and can lead to, I think, engagement and, again, building out a sense of common effort to learn about how to use the internet to make the world a better place, which is the focus of that course. There's a really cool professor at University of Connecticut, Marian Rebega, who teaches a bird behavior course, a bird biology course. And she, a few years ago, started using the hashtag #birdclass, and she forced her students to get a Twitter account. Most did not have one, and then through the course of the semester, the students are asked, one of their standing assignments is that when they witness a bird doing some unusual behavior, they're supposed to tweet about it, which is implicitly kind of fun. And she found that students' engagement with bird behavior was much stronger through looking at a bird in the real world and putting it through their device in the virtual world, that was a better outcome. So of course, you know, a big chunk of the world is not on the internet, and this picture, which I've put on .earth repeatedly, shows you this, that both in terms of access to energy and access to information, many countries still are in the digital darkness. This is Guinea. This picture was taken, I think, in 2010 or so. And it's kids who have to migrate from their slums where there's no electricity to an airport parking lot to do their homework. And that's a travesty in this day and age. But it's also a great opportunity, finding ways to bring cheap illumination to their houses, even as they're going to remain off the grid, the conventional grid, for a while, is an incredible opportunity for some young innovator here. So making sure that people here, especially students, understand this reality and these opportunities is really important. Now, here's what's exciting, that darkness is abating at a rapid rate. This is a slide. This is data from the International Telecommunications Union, ITU.int, and it shows you, as I'm sure many of you know, there's been explosive growth in cell phone subscriptions around the world, like 700 million in 2000. Most of those, the blue is rich countries. Now it's, well, as of 2010, and I'm overdue to get a new data from them. 2010, 5 billion cell phone subscriptions, and 3/4 of them are in poorer countries. And that says, again, that something very powerful is going on. And I'm sure you've heard about how that connectivity can change lives. It's that's how people do their banking in many African countries. It's how farmers get their crop price before they go to sell their crops, again in Africa. So you can kind of get a sense of, you can have better economic outcomes for poor people, on and on. And the life-changing potential in a little energy and a little connectivity is just stunning. One of my colleagues, Libby Rosenthal, did a story in 2010 where she went to Kenya, to a rural village, where a woman, the one in the top there, got tired of having to go into town to charge her cell phone once a week. And so she saved up money to buy a cheap Chinese-made solar panel to put on her roof of her mud hut. And that was transformative. Not only was she able to charge her phone and give her kids lighting to do their homework by, but she had excess energy and was charging her neighbors' cell phones at a modest rate. She actually created a business. And then the only thing that's been a trouble for her is that her neighbors saw the potential here, and they've now saved up money and started buying their own solar panels, so they're putting her out of business too. But you can see how that's basically set a fire there, that a little bit of connectivity and a little bit of energy can be transformative. And so even as we're thinking about what kind of light bulb to screw in, there's just these enormous opportunities for business models that can foster that kind of access and change. It's just an amazing, exciting time. And in South Africa, so that's, it's one thing to have a telephone to tweet on, but it's another to have real bandwidth. And one thing that I learned about from a development analyst at Harvard named Calestis Juma is the impact that the World Cup coming to South Africa had on bandwidth in Africa. There was some very smart investors who said, hey, why don't we lay an undersea cable, a fiber optic cable, which are commonplace around many parts of the world, from South Africa to Europe, and then we'll have enough bandwidth to broadcast the World Cup in HD to everybody around the world, and that all worked out great. And that cable got laid. It was almost all African investment money, and there was no World Bank, no philanthropy involved. And now that cable is providing excess bandwidth that's sharply dropping the cost of getting on the internet in parts of Africa. This is the cable coming ashore in Tanzania. All the countries along the eastern shore of Africa are tying into this cable, which, as you can see, is on the seabed. Very standard technology. And again, it's transformative. So the Knowosphere, the sort of backbone of the Knowosphere, is expanding really rapidly. And the website down there, ccom.mu, is for the company. If you want to they have a map of their global fiber optic network and stuff like that. It's really interesting to look at. So, and now we get to learning, the classroom. This is a map of schools around the Atlantic Ocean that were participants in a project called AtlanticRising.org. And many of these schools now talk to each other through Skype. You can see it includes Ghana and Sierra Leone and Scotland and Nantucket and Guyana. It's kind of an exciting little mini network. And what they do is the young British educators went on a trip around the Atlantic Ocean for a year or so, doing workshops on sea level rise, just so communities and the kids got cognizant of what 3 feet of sea level rise would mean, and do all kinds of shoreside learning about that, and then stay in touch with kids in other coastal communities and get to reflect on their common experience. And that so much of what we think of as a local issue really are global when you have the connections to understand that. And AtlanticRising.org, it's kind of dormant now, but go to that website and you can find out more. I wrote about them on .earth as well. And you know, one of the great innovations in America was the extension service, the idea of having land-grant colleges and government offices that were helping farmers innovate and share good ideas. And this, of course, you know, it's a no-brainer to think of the Knowosphere, the internet, as making that all doable at the global scale. And just Google for the phrase yield gap, to see how much potential there is. Sometimes with just different practices, different knowledge, and sometimes with fertilizer or a better strain of crop. To close, there's a huge gap between American yields of, let's say, chickpeas or soybeans and those in rural parts of Africa. So having more crosstalk can close that yield gap and allow agriculture to keep up with demand as people try to get better diets and have more money to spend on food. Now, all of this basically we're building Match.com, but it's like Match.com for everything, not just relationships. Scientists Without Borders is a great example. New York Academy of Sciences. That's at nyas.org, or just Google for Scientists Without Borders. They're trying to set up kind of a Match.com for problems and scientists who might be able to help solve them. And again, it has a focus on development issues. Innocentive is a profit-making model of an idea and skill intelligence sharing system where companies with problems can kind of post them on the web, and the inventive people among us can help solve those as well. And I'm sure many of you, if you haven't already done philanthropy of your own, given money to a project through either global giving or Kickstarter, again, we're seeing a revolution in the ability for anyone to dive into with a bright idea and find the capital to help make it concrete. That's very exciting as well. I've given to a couple of Kickstarter projects, and it's just really fun to see how that plays out. Now, again, getting back to disaster, the theme of readiness for disasters and avoiding the worst kinds of outcomes. This is a case, I've written too much, unfortunately, about earthquake losses. This was the Sichuan province earthquake in China a few years ago, and those kids all died in that school. And that school fell down because it was not old, it was just put together in a bad way. Now, some of that is probably inevitably because of corruption and just cheating, but some of it was a lack of knowledge. And so what can I do as a communicator to make schools more robust? Well, I can kind of try to spread understanding of how to make them robust on a budget. So I did, I'm not sure if this video clip got loaded, but there's an engineer at Purdue who had come up with a really great design for a building. And maybe you'll be able to see it here. It's a way to use the same materials that go into a building now, and many schools are built this way, and just to have you rearrange the materials and the building doesn't fall down as readily in an earthquake. And so my son, who created this animation to show how this design works, my son at the time was a sophomore at Pace University. And I asked him, so can you put this engineer's idea into motion? And he did. So that was the standard design. And if you put all the bricks in one section between two columns, and here's a physical test of a 3-story structure done that way, you end up with a safer building. So you have the engineer, you have the young animator, and you have the communicator, and between the three of us, we've hopefully got that design out on the web in ways that can influence builders in poorer countries where there's this unbelievable building boom underway right now. I'd like to do more like that. I don't think it's nearly enough. I want to get it seen in Pakistan and in India, in countries, again, where schools are being built at a blistering pace. So here's another example. I was at a meeting a couple of years ago of science teachers and science teachers at the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting, and the whole session was built around what science teachers want. And one thing they want is little 1-minute videos, little introductory explainer videos about whatever, momentum or climate, greenhouse gases, and I know, again, like my son, there's many young communication students who have all these skills at movie making and animation. So putting those two skill sets together having a place where a science teacher can post a question, busy science teacher seeks, and then the community of communicators can deliver. So say the science teacher wants to have kids learn about geoengineering, and this is the idea that we can do stuff to the atmosphere to counteract the warming that we're already doing to the atmosphere. And some kids in California a few years ago put together something that's kind of a fun take on that, which I think you'll see now.
And you may have to click play. If it didn't start playing, go ahead and click play.
It's going. So you get the idea. You know, there's aspects of that film that aren't perfect. So in a perfect world, there would be a portal where a teacher can say what they want, or anyone can. Some students cobble together kind of a beta version of an animation or a film. And then scientists would say, well, it's not exactly like that. It's not about solar radiation so much as greenhouse gases. But then you can have a conversation, and then you can improve the material until it's ready for prime time. And then you can show it to kids around the world and have growing awareness on a budget. You can have great learning done at bargain price, which is something, of course, that these days anything that can be done cheaply is going to get you pretty far. And then even in terms of regulatory ability, regulatory issues like fracking, there was a guy in Pennsylvania a few years ago during the peak of the boom in drilling there who realized that a lot of the data on drilling in Pennsylvania was public, and he just assembled a GIS-driven map that shows you you can click on any one of these little widgets, and you can kind of find for your area, or where, you know, if you were going to buy a house there, you'd want to know, were there any violations, any leaks? Is this a well that was already drilled? Has it been fracked already? Is it being fracked? And this database is at fractrack.org is kind of the community doing its own part to facilitate having oversight of this process that's still, you know, and you can see there, of course, the New York border is the area to the north where there hasn't been any drilling yet, and hopefully the same kind of process will be set up going forward to help New Yorkers understand the issues and opportunities here. And a lot of what I see as the potential for in this arena isn't part of some web-based revolution. It's just it's a way of thinking about things in a new way. You know, I can show you or tell you the volume of the atmosphere, the whole, you know, the atmosphere around us. I can tell you the volume. It's some number of millions of cubic kilometers. Or I can show you. And Adam Neiman, an artist, science illustrator in England, came up with this way of expressing that volume. That is the whole atmosphere. If all the air in the atmosphere were at sea level pressure, that's what it would look like compared to the size of the Earth. And I think it's a great starting point for conversation about the global commons that we share, things like the atmosphere, and in this case, the ocean. That little green bubble that's all the world's liquid water. If you peeled the oceans, remember the oceans are just 2 miles thick, 2 miles deep, and I've sailed across 2 of them, so I know how voluminous and amazingly large they are, but they're really, it's not a large volume when you compare it to the size of the planet. And so you can have great pedagogy here too, because you could say to your class, if it's a geography class, okay, now class, give me what would the size of the bubble be for all the world's drinkable water, or fresh water, and they would realize when they came back overnight that it's actually too small to even see on that scale. There would be a tiny, tiny bubble, less than 1% by far of the world's total water. And so there's great learning experiences to be had just in thinking afresh about these kinds of questions. And another thing that's that the internet offers, though, is kind of ways out of what Randy Olson, a friend of mine, calls the nerd loop, where we're always cogitating about how to communicate, but talking to each other about how to communicate instead of just experimenting. And I think he's really onto something on .earth. I've periodically participated in some experiments. The piece on the left, postcard from the Pleistocene, was scientists going out in the field in Siberia. I couldn't go with them, which would have been the traditional media role. But he sent some photos and some audio clips of him and their students talking about what they were seeing, and I put it on the blog as kind of a collaborative form of communication. And at the right is Richard Alley, who's the ultimate communication innovator. He's the host of the recent Earth, the Operator's Manual special on PBS. He's a Penn State climatologist. He likes to sing about geology and climatology. That's one of his, on YouTube. Well, if you Google for the singing climatologist, you'll see a post I wrote about him. A really cool guy. And of course, he has tenure, so he has the flexibility to be goofy and not worry about his career. So that's not for everybody, but it is for some people. Now, another thing that's really important is, everything, much of what I've just discussed is about virtual ways of conveying ideas, but you still need to have students exposed to the real muddy, sticky, itchy world. And but you can have what I call hybrid experience that I think could be very valuable. There's one last clip here that I'd like you to see before we do some Q&A. So my son and I went into, we were in Florida near where my parents live. And he shot this little video. He was 9 at the time. And there's a really fun moment at the end. I love that sound when he takes that breath. Yes, indeed. So what's really powerful there, we all look at that and say, oh, that's so great, kid in nature, yay, 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 Richard Louv, no child left inside. But what I think is even more powerful is that he was able to capture that, just like the students in the Bird Class course, and share it with the world, because we're all implicitly storytellers. You just look at what's happened with YouTube. And by doing that, I think there's an even richer relationship to the experience that he has as a result of having shared it. And I put that on .earth a few years ago. It's been seen by thousands of people. He has that understanding of connecting with his experience with the rest of the world. And that, I think, illustrates the power of hybrid experience, that you do still need to get wet, but it's great to share that once you do get wet or buggy or muddy. And that's kind of that's a hub and spoke system, people doing real things on campuses, connecting with others around the world, and then moving forward and building, again, what I'm calling for now, for shorthand's sake, the Noosphere. We are here. That's that great Carl Sagan description of the pale blue dot that inspired .earth, the name of my blog. And I'm easy to find by most means. So again, I think there's time for some Q&A, and we can start with that. Thank you for listening.
So to clap for Andy, you can hover over the smiley face icon and go down to applause. I know it's hard to find. The common complaint. The difficulty here will be you may accidentally raise your hand thinking that hand icon is applause. And if you raise your hand, we're going to call on you to take the microphone and ask Andy a question. So you can either put a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand using that hand icon, and I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. So Richard is asking if you're in New York City, Andy.
I live in the Hudson Valley, about 1 hour north of New York City.
I'm sure that's not the question you expected, but I think Richard's actually in the New York area, which may be why he asked the question.
Oh, I'm happy
to
connect.
Anybody else? So I'm wondering if you see that question there in the chat. If you could have schools around the world embrace one core concept, what would it be?
Sharing, just connecting. A few years ago, my son, when he was still in elementary school, a teacher set up kind of a electronic pen pal thing for them, but it was with kids in New Jersey, and I thought that was not really reaching enough. So it's all about connecting with other schools, finding ways for students to interact with scientists, many of whom are pretty accessible, more accessible than we think. Can be found easily on Twitter. Many scientists have blogs. And then sharing your learning as much as you can. Doing a hashtag for a course. It could be an undergraduate course, a high school course. Even down the chain, I think you could find ways to use Twitter to sort of exclaim about what you're learning.
So Marianne from Get Ideas at Cisco is asking, can you talk a little more about how mobile tech is transforming the formal education opportunities for students?
Well, I'll just go back to the example of Marian Robega at University of Connecticut, where I mentioned the bird class hashtag as a way for her students to do an assignment where there's benefit for the teacher there too, because every time a student tweets about bird behavior, putting that hashtag brand on it, there's a timestamp for that. So looking back through the course of a week or the semester, Rubega can then assess the student's performance pretty efficiently because it's all out there on Twitter, the history of each bird observation. And I just think about how that could be applied to other disciplines. It doesn't have to be bird behavior. It could be anything that students are tasked with keeping track of. You could even have students keep an information diary. How are you learning about the world? What through the course of a day, how did you learn the news that you learned that day? And then reflecting on how much of that came through a smartphone, how much of that came through YouTube, how much of that came through reading an actual book or something. You could then have an informative discussion about the nature of learning and how we figure things out. So it's just a matter of it's kind of like what I said about Adam Neiman's illustrations. It's just looking at the challenge and opportunities in learning in a fresh way, and seeing, is there a way to use these tools creatively to connect, to have students. I'll give you one other example. This is also from the university level, but it doesn't have to be. I learned about a professor at Wellesley years ago who was teaching U.S.-Russia relations, and she used Skype. But she had someone she had met at St. Petersburg University in Russia who was teaching U.S.-Russian relations, and they started co-teaching. So that through Skype at that time, they had U.S. and Russian students learning about U.S.-Russian relations together, and it's a very old-fashioned way to think about how to make the world a better place. Just have us all learning in one space at one time is really cool.
We've got a couple of questions from Lydia. The first is, what are your experiences with the difference in digital literacy and understanding with children around the globe?
Well, my experience is still pretty limited in the sense that, well, in Turkey I saw how there can be learning this way. Whether I'd have to dive into the literature or to go on Twitter or to kind of put out a question. Yeah, how many people are using these technologies in these ways? There's probably people involved with this conference who have a better answer to that question than I could provide. So for me, it's still anecdotal in a sense of having seen a few interesting experiments gives me the excitement that I have about this. But it's not, I can't, it's a good homework assignment for me. I will dig in and see if I can answer that question.
She also asks if you agree with Thomas Friedman's idea about the world being flat. Is that reflected in your travels and experiences?
Well, in terms of access to knowledge, until right now, and even right now still, it's not flat. So I think when he was talking about trade and commerce and globalization, there are many areas that are flattening in a hurry, but I'll give you one example of where things are very unflat, and that's access to scientific literature. Right now, most of the more important science research that's done, medical science, is behind paywalls at very expensive journals. And there's a shift underway toward having that change, but and even the norms for where scientists try to publish their articles. There was a survey that I don't think I wrote about this, but I might have tweeted about it a couple of years ago. That the scientists, they were doing a survey of scientists. What are the aspects you want to see in a journal that you want to publish in? And access, global access, is not one of the priorities. So that's an area where things are not flat even remotely. So I'd have to say it's still a variegated landscape, that some things are really completely flat now, but there's many places and situations where there isn't equal access to the kinds of things that we would need to have a prosperous, sort of globally prosperous outcome.
David Donovan asks, is the expansion of the internet to developing countries allowing for easier access to primary education?
Primary education, I think, from what I can tell so far, is still, it hasn't really, in a rural part of India, you're not going to have kids at the primary level learning with remote technology. And even in Istanbul, where I was, the learning is still very much in the classroom and not part of what I was seeing in the community center where the kids were engaging on things like Facebook in ways that had the potential to be in the classroom. So there's still a big, again, that's an area where there's still a long ways to go. Now, going forward, again, I think there have to be models for having that work out. Not necessarily globally, but within India, for example, where they simply can't build schools fast enough to reach the level of kids because of high fertility rates that are being born and getting into school age. There have to be models where you could have that community center that I mentioned, or its equivalent, be a learning hub as well, that will avoid the need to have constantly to be building more and more brick-and-mortar schools. And again, I think here the ideas are still ahead of the actual outcomes. I think we're at the early stages of this.
We still have a minute or two. If you'd like to ask Andy a question, you can raise your hand using the hand icon at the top of the participant window, and I'll give you the microphone, or you can put your question in the chat. I'm curious as to your experiences with your son and the degree to which his own education is reflecting some of your desires. Well,
the two sons, one is very much into animation, and I think he likes the idea of, he wants to go into the movie business in the end, so he doesn't really necessarily want to be making films that can help foster sustainable design in earthquake zones. But he's certainly attuned to that partially through what we did. The younger one, he's 14 now, so I don't think he's already demonstrated that those experiences have changed his life path. And I think that would be true for any kid, where all you can do is expose them to experience, and then they become who they'll become. In fact, in my teaching at Pace University, one of the courses I teach now, I co-teach a documentary production course where general interest communication students are making documentaries about issues related to sustainable use of resources. The last couple of years, we did a film on shrimp farming, another one on the cork forests of Portugal, which are a big source of the corks that go into bottles around the world. And those forests are under pressure now because of the shift toward other kinds of ways to close wine bottles. So these are kids who really, they didn't grow up wanting to become sustainable environmental communicators. They want to be filmmakers or news reporters. But now, because they spent a few months working on a film about a story like that, they got this sense of these issues in their heads. And to me, that's actually better than churning out more environmental studies majors. Just having that kind of consciousness spill over into other areas, I think, is really important. But it implies just you have to sort of just provide the experience and then let them be who they'll be.
Well, there was a comment in the chat early on in your presentation about the inability to fit these things into the structures or test-driven culture of K-12. Have you found that to be true of your own children's experience?
Well, it's always a battle, and which is why I think an ideal tool to create is, as I was saying, is sort of a match.com for the stuff that teachers need. So when they're in a rush, they're putting together a presentation on momentum, basic concept of physics. They have a place they can go to where they know there's a curated little 1-minute video on that might be fun and goofy and use little car race or something and show you the basics. So you want to make it to fit this into the way we do stuff. You're going to have to find ways to make it easy for teachers to find the material and to incorporate it and to know that it's reliable. So that's the kind of there are challenges there for sure.
Mary Ann's wondering if the recent storm, I'm assuming Sandy, and the loss of power changed your perspective on the Internet of Things.
The Internet of Things?
Well, I read the question thinking you might know what it was, but...
I've been through a number of multi-day power failures here in the Hudson Valley. We had a blizzard, two different blizzards in the last 3 years, plus this storm, plus Irene. And I miss connectivity when it's not there for sure. But I've tended to try desperately to find a way to regain it. But those moments also remind you of the value of analog experience and splitting firewood and hauling water can be a good tonic for those of us who spend too much time in front of a screen.
It looks like we may actually have an audio question for our final question. Sabas Webb, if you intended to take the microphone, you can click on the talk button at the top left of your screen.
Yeah, it's on. Am I audible?
I hear you.
Oh, hello, Andy. How are you doing?
Good.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if I also take units on sustainability. And what I personally feel is when we are teaching it, or we are showing videos and triggers, we are giving triggers and all, that children are very excited. And they are, in full swing that, yes ma'am, we should save it, and the earth should be saved, and everything should be saved kind of a mode. But after, when a batch has passed and has gone to another grade, maybe, at that point of time, I think the impact has lessened quite a bit, the impact on them. And what bothers me is when they will be graduating from school, they'll be passing out of the school. At that point of time, I don't know how much of, the content they will be taking with them, and the feelings which we want to be instilled in them throughout. That is what bothers me. What happens with you?
Well, it's that's one of the great questions is how do you have impactful moments with students? As you know, they're passing on through a life that will have all kinds of other issues pressing on them, how to get a job. And I think there, all you can do is make sure that the experiences are rich enough that they're the kind of thing that will stick in their brains. And again, there's lots of pressures against this. The way we teach now is so focused on evaluation and less on experience that you're constantly fighting. Yeah. You're fighting a battle there for sure. So finding a way for even a moment to get the kids outside, looking at a stream or some urban patch of green, essentially you're operating on faith that some of that will stick with that kid even as the kid goes forward into a more materialistic life. And one thing I think is, again, it'll always be a fight, is to build into learning experience kind of a systems approach to things that kids otherwise take for granted. If there's one thing I could add, if I were like the grand poobah of education, if there's one thing I could add, especially in American suburban or urban areas, is to have the kids spend a day looking at their school as a system. Where does the heat come from? Where does the electricity come from? Go into the boiler room, have the janitor or the maintenance people show them around. What kind of windows do we have? Why is there a draft in this room? Isn't that costing us money? How much paper do we print every year? There's a school I went to where the students realized their printers had counters, and they could actually tally up how much paper they were using in a year. So just that alone would be a great thing. And then they'll go home and say, hey, why is that window open? What's wrong with our furnace? Or you could build in a little bit more of a sense of awareness that way.
Okay, thanks.
No, it's great. Great question.
So, Andy, this is Lucy. I finally get to talk to you in person. Thank you so much for being here today.
I'm really glad.
This has been a really fabulous talk, and I want to make sure everybody has enough time to get to the next session. If you have follow-up questions for Andy, he's got his contact information here, and we'd love to continue this conversation somehow going forward. And I think that you're speaking to a theme that we're seeing in the conference about innovation with technology to solve complex problems. And having that match.com for teachers is so up the alley of what some of our themes that, some of our talks have been about. I'm thinking of Karen Cater from the Department of Education, the Office of Educational Technology. This is something that she's probably contemplating as we speak. So thanks again to Andy. Everybody's been great with great questions. I have to boot everybody out of here in order to process the recording, but you can review it later with all the great links that Andy gave us. And we really appreciate your time.
It was great to be part of this. Thank you.